Karen entered in my home without permission and cut the oxygen line, didn't know whole thing recorded on camera. Before we dive into the story, let us know where you're watching from. The morning light filtered softly through the curtains, casting a warm glow over the small living room. It was quiet, the kind of stillness that made everything feel slow and peaceful. For most, it was just another day in a quiet suburban neighborhood. But for Sarah, the routine was carefully crafted to manage the constraints of her condition. Oxygen tubing ran along the floor from the concentrator beside her couch, a constant reminder of the fragility of her health. She had been living with a severe respiratory condition for years, and without the steady supply of oxygen, simple tasks like breathing would become an exhausting struggle. Each morning she would wake up to the familiar sound of the oxygen machine humming softly in the corner, the rhythmic pulse of it like a heartbeat, keeping her going. Her hands would carefully adjust the nasal cannula that rested over her nose, a ritual that had become as automatic as breathing itself. She'd make her coffee, decaf now, to avoid the unnecessary excitement, and sit in her chair by the window. From there, Sarah could see the neighbors as they came and went, the cars pulling out of driveways, the occasional wave exchange with those who were familiar. It was peaceful, serene, the world moving around her while she stayed in her safe space. Karen, her neighbor, was an entirely different story. Sarah had lived in the neighborhood for a few years, and over time, she had come to expect Karen's frequent visits. Karen had an unsettling habit of offering unsolicited advice about anything and everything. From the way Sarah managed her oxygen setup to how she could improve her diet or even her life choices, Karen had an opinion. She would knock on Sarah's door at odd hours, pretending to be concerned about her well-being, though Sarah could never shake the feeling that her neighbor's interest wasn't entirely selfless. Today was no different. Just as Sarah was about to settle into her chair with her morning coffee, she heard a knock at the door. Not a friendly, light tap, but a firm, insistent knock that almost made her jump. She sighed, feeling the weight of another unsolicited interaction on the horizon. "Sarah, it's Karen from next door," came the familiar voice. Sarah had no doubt that Karen had some new, helpful advice to offer. It wasn't even a question anymore. It was a constant part of her life now. The doorbell rang again, followed by another knock, each one louder than the last. Without much energy to argue, Sarah slowly shuffled to the door, making sure the oxygen line didn't get tangled. It wasn't that she didn't appreciate people checking in. It was just that Karen's visits always seemed to come with a certain sense of control, like her way was the only way. "Good morning, Sarah. How are we feeling today?" Karen's voice was sweet, but there was always something just a little too eager in it, as though she were trying to see what advice she could dish out today. Sarah gave her a tired smile, already knowing what was coming next. "I'm fine, Karen. Just enjoying a quiet morning." Karen, standing in the doorway, eyed the oxygen machine with her usual skepticism. "You know, I read something about these machines. They say you don't need to have it running all day long. Have you thought about turning it off for a few hours? Maybe you'd feel better if you gave your body a little break," Karen offered, her tone full of concern, though it lacked the understanding Sarah desperately needed. Sarah didn't respond immediately, her eyes drifting back to the machine, silently grateful for its steady hum. Without it, her energy would drain so quickly she wouldn't be able to leave the couch for the rest of the day, let alone engage in a conversation. She had learned long ago that Karen's brand of concern often came without any real comprehension of the situation at hand. But Sarah was too tired to argue today. She simply nodded, allowing Karen to continue her unsolicited advice, the routine she had come to expect with every visit. The sound of the doorbell ringing again broke Sarah's fragile peace. She glanced toward the door, heart sinking a little. It was Karen, of course. Sarah didn't have to wonder what the topic would be this time. Her nerves tensed as she made her way to the door, the familiar click of the oxygen machine in the background. "Sarah, honey, are you all right?" Karen's voice was loud and a little too cheery, her face pressing up against the door's window. "I've been hearing that oxygen machine of yours, and it sounds so, I don't know, loud? Maybe it's too much for you." Sarah wasn't in the mood for another one of Karen's well-meaning but ill-informed critiques. She hadn't even noticed the sound of the machine until Karen pointed it out, and now it seemed amplified in the stillness of the morning. "I'm fine, Karen. It's just the machine," Sarah said, forcing a smile. She could already feel the irritation creeping in, but she knew there wasn't much point in arguing. Karen was one of those people who never really heard anything other than her own voice, but Karen wasn't going to let it go that easily. I've been doing some reading, and I'm really worried about you. I think maybe the oxygen is doing more harm than good. I mean, it's just sitting there running all the time. I'm sure you could probably go without it for a little while. She stepped forward, her expression growing more serious. In fact, I think I should take a look at the machine. I'm sure it's too loud for you, and I can help you adjust it. Sarah stood frozen for a moment, trying to process what Karen was saying. Was Karen really suggesting she stop using the oxygen, or just turn it off for a while? I really don't think that's necessary, Karen, Sarah replied, her voice shaking slightly from the tension. I know how the machine works, and I'm not having any issues with it. But Karen, with her usual air of certainty, wasn't listening. Before Sarah could say anything else, Karen was already pushing past her, stepping into the house without waiting for an invitation. Don't worry, I'm not going to touch anything. I just want to make sure it's all running smoothly for you. Karen's tone was full of false reassurance. Sarah felt a wave of discomfort wash over her as she stepped back, watching helplessly as Karen made her way toward the oxygen concentrator. I really don't think you should, Sarah started, but Karen was already crouching down next to the machine, squinting at it with a critical eye. See? It's too loud. I'm telling you, this is all wrong. I've read all about these things. Karen said it with such authority, as if she knew more about Sarah's medical needs than Sarah herself. Karen reached for the tubing, pulling it out of its secure place and inspecting it like she was a professional. Her fingers, unsteady with confidence, adjusted the settings without any real understanding of what she was doing. Sarah's heart began to race, panic seeping into her thoughts. Karen, please stop. You don't know what you're doing, Sarah pleaded, taking a step toward her, but her voice was drowned out by Karen's insistence. No, I'm sure I can fix this. I read that sometimes these machines work better if the flow is lower. You don't need as much oxygen as it's giving you. Maybe if I just cut this line here? The words froze Sarah's blood. She watched powerless as Karen grabbed a pair of scissors from the table without even glancing at her. In one swift motion, she snipped the oxygen line, cutting off the life-sustaining flow of air. The sharp sound of the scissors cutting through the tubing echoed in the quiet room. Sarah gasped, her breath hitching in her chest. It took a moment for the reality of what had just happened to hit her. The oxygen, the one thing she needed more than anything, was gone. Karen, you... Sarah's voice broke, her throat tightening as she felt the familiar, suffocating weight of panic beginning to settle in. She tried to breathe, but there was no relief. Without the oxygen, she felt her chest constricting, every breath coming with effort. Karen, completely unaware of the damage she had caused, stood up with a satisfied nod. There, that should help. It was way too high before, don't you think? She said, as if she'd just made everything better. Sarah's hands trembled as she fought for breath, her vision starting to blur. She reached for her phone, struggling to stay conscious. The room felt like it was closing in on her, the air thinning, her mind clouded with panic. But Karen was oblivious, happily surveying her work. You're welcome, Sarah. You're going to feel so much better now. The room began to tilt as Sarah's lungs screamed for air. She grabbed the edge of the table for support, her vision narrowing as her breaths came in short, frantic gasps. The absence of oxygen hit her like a wave, cold and suffocating. Her chest tightened with each passing second, the familiar weight of panic settling over her. It was like trying to breathe underwater. Every inhalation a desperate attempt to fill her lungs. But there was nothing, just emptiness. Karen, please. Sarah's voice was weak, barely above a whisper, but Karen didn't seem to hear. Her back was turned, busy looking at the now disconnected oxygen line, as if the problem was already solved. Sarah's hand trembled as she reached for her phone. The screen seemed miles away, the effort of even lifting it feeling like too much. Her mind was beginning to fog, the panic tightening around her chest. She pressed the home button, her fingers slick with sweat, and the screen lit up. Her eyes searched desperately for the emergency contact, but her vision blurred with each passing second. Karen, please, I need... She gasped again, the words cutting off in a dry, wheezing cough. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. The oxygen that had always been there was now just a distant memory, and her body was starting to protest with every frantic heartbeat. Karen turned around, her expression still holding a hint of confusion. "What's wrong? You're looking a little—" The sight of Sarah clutching at her throat, her lips turning a faint shade of blue, stopped her mid-sentence. Her eyes widened in realization. "Oh my God," she whispered, taking a step forward. Sarah's body swayed dangerously, her legs threatening to give way beneath her. She tried to speak, to explain, but her throat felt like it was closing in on itself. The room was spinning now, the edges of her vision darkening as each breath came harder than the last. The fear was consuming her, her body fighting against the lack of oxygen as it fought for survival. "Sarah, I didn't mean to—" Karen's voice was strained now, panic creeping in, but there was nothing she could do, nothing that could reverse what she had done. She stared at the scissors still lying on the table, realizing too late the magnitude of her actions. She stumbled toward Sarah, her hands hovering uncertainly. "What do I do? I'll call someone." Karen fumbled for her phone, but her shaking hands made it hard to focus. Sarah, her vision now clouded with darkness, managed to press the emergency contact button on her own phone, her breath shallow and labored. The call barely rang before a voice answered, crisp and sharp. 911, what's your emergency? I can't breathe, Sarah managed to choke out, each word coming in a strained, gasping breath. "I need oxygen. I can't breathe." "Stay calm, we're sending someone right now," the operator said, but her words barely registered in Sarah's fading consciousness. The sound of Karen's frantic movements filled the room, but everything felt distant now. Karen's voice was shaky as she spoke into the phone, repeating what Sarah had said, her words a jumble of confusion and fear. "She can't breathe. The oxygen line. It was cut. I didn't mean to." Sarah's mind was slipping, the noise of Karen's panic fading away. She felt her body weakening, each breath coming slower, more labored. Her hand was still clutching the phone, the connection to the operator now a lifeline, but it seemed like it was growing harder to hold on. The air in the room felt thick, oppressive, like there was nothing left for her lungs to take in. She heard Karen's voice again, now pleading, but it was like she was underwater, the words muffled and distant. "Please, just stay with me," Karen's voice cracked, but Sarah couldn't respond. It was as if she were fading, slipping into unconsciousness. The weight on her chest only grew heavier, every breath like a struggle against her own body, and everything around her was starting to blur into darkness. The room felt eerily quiet when Sarah finally came to, her body weak and exhausted from the ordeal. The medical team had arrived just in time, but the lingering effects of the oxygen deprivation were still present, a dull ache in her chest that wouldn't go away. Her head felt foggy, like she was trying to piece together the fragments of a dream she couldn't fully remember. But the memory of the panic, the breathlessness, was vivid, sharp, and real. Karen had left soon after the paramedics arrived, her frantic apologies and promises to help ringing hollow in Sarah's ears. But the damage had been done. The oxygen line, the one thing she relied on, had been tampered with, and Karen's well-intentioned but reckless interference had nearly cost Sarah everything. A few days later, as Sarah sat in her living room, her thoughts began to circle back to the incident. She had tried to forget the terror of that moment, but the uncertainty about what exactly happened lingered in her mind. Something about the entire situation didn't sit right. There was a sense of betrayal, but also confusion. What had Karen been thinking? Why hadn't she stopped when Sarah asked her to? Her eyes fell on the security camera monitor that sat in the corner of the room. The system was something she had installed a while ago, just as a precaution after a few too many awkward encounters with neighbors who didn't seem to know when to stop. She had never expected to use the footage for something like this, but the need to understand, to see for herself, was too strong to ignore. With a deep breath, Sarah clicked through the recordings on the small screen. The footage of Karen's uninvited visit appeared on the screen, clear as day. Sarah's fingers trembled slightly as she hit play, watching her own front door swing open, Karen stepping into the frame. The footage played in real time. The first thing that struck Sarah was how casual Karen had seemed, walking in like it was any other day. There was no hesitation, no sense of apology for entering uninvited. In fact, there was a strange confidence in her movements, like she believed she was doing the right thing. Sarah's stomach twisted as she watched Karen approach the oxygen machine, her face filled with that familiar self-assured expression, the one she always wore when she was about to help. Sarah leaned in closer, her breath catching in her throat. Karen bent down next to the machine, adjusting the settings, inspecting the oxygen line. Sarah could see her hands move quickly, almost too quickly. She could see the exact moment Karen grabbed the scissors from the table and began cutting the tubing without a second thought. It all happened so fast. Sarah had been too distracted, too desperate for air, to see it clearly at the time. Watching it now, it was like a punch to the gut. The sense of helplessness flooded back, but this time, it was tinged with something else. Betrayal. Betrayal that someone who was supposed to be a neighbor, a friend even, had acted with such carelessness. She had asked Karen to stop, to leave it alone, but Karen had ignored her, and now it was all on camera. The proof, the undeniable evidence of what had happened, was playing in front of her eyes. The anger came next, a slow burn that started deep in her chest. It wasn't just the reckless interference with her medical equipment. It was the complete disregard for her well-being. Karen had never asked for permission, never checked if it was okay. There was no consideration, no respect for the fact that Sarah's life depended on that oxygen. Sarah could feel her hands clenching into fists as she watched Karen fumble with the tubing, oblivious to the damage she was causing. And then, there was the vulnerability. Seeing herself, helpless and struggling to breathe, had been bad enough in real life. But now watching it on video felt like a violation. Karen's actions weren't just careless, they were invasive. They were a stark reminder of how exposed Sarah had been in that moment, how fragile her body was, and how easily someone else's actions could rip away the one thing she needed to survive. It was like watching a part of herself be torn apart, and it stung more than she had expected. As the video ended, Sarah sat back, her chest tightening once again. The image of Karen cutting the line, her face full of misguided confidence, was burned into her mind. The room around her felt colder now, the weight of everything she had just watched sinking in. She didn't know what to do with this knowledge, this footage, but she knew one thing for certain: she could never look at Karen the same way again. Sarah sat in her living room, her hands clasped tightly together as she stared out the window. The footage was still fresh in her mind. The image of Karen, scissors in hand, cutting the oxygen line without a second thought. She had spent days replaying that moment, trying to make sense of it, trying to understand why Karen had done what she did. There was no denying the fear, the helplessness she had felt in that moment. But now there was something else. Anger, yes, but also a strange, gnawing need to understand. She had to confront Karen. There was no other choice. She needed answers, needed closure. But more than that, she needed to set boundaries. She couldn't let this go, not without making it clear that her health, her safety, was not something to be tampered with. Taking a deep breath, Sarah grabbed her phone and texted Karen, asking if she could stop by for a quick conversation. She stared at the message for a moment before hitting send. It wasn't easy, the thought of facing Karen again, but it was necessary. A few hours later, the doorbell rang. Karen was standing on the porch, a hesitant look in her eyes as she shuffled her feet nervously. She hadn't been this unsure of herself before. The last time they'd spoken, Karen had been so certain that what she was doing was for Sarah's own good. Now that confidence was replaced with an awkward, almost apologetic energy. "Hey, Sarah," Karen said softly, her voice strained. "You wanted to talk?" Sarah nodded, stepping aside to let Karen in. She could feel the weight of the moment hanging between them. There was so much she needed to say, but she didn't know where to start. "Can we sit down?" Sarah gestured to the couch, and Karen followed her into the living room, her steps hesitant. "I'm sorry about what happened," Karen said, sitting down across from Sarah. Her eyes were downcast, avoiding Sarah's gaze. I didn't mean to cause you any harm. I just thought Well, I thought I was helping. I know it probably seems like I overstepped, but I thought that maybe the machine was too loud for you, or maybe you didn't need it running so much. I thought maybe you'd feel better without it. Sarah exhaled, the words hanging in the air. The confusion, the helplessness she had felt during the incident, was slowly being replaced with a deep sense of betrayal. Karen had truly believed she was helping. That much was clear. But the more Sarah thought about it, the more it became evident how little Karen actually understood about what Sarah was going through. How could Karen, who had no medical training, think she could fix something so crucial to Sarah's well-being? I asked you to stop, Sarah said, her voice steady but firm. I told you that it wasn't necessary, but you didn't listen. You didn't respect what I was saying, Karen. You just barged in, took control, and started messing with something that I rely on to breathe. You didn't think about what could happen if you made a mistake. Karen's face flushed, her eyes welling up with guilt. She nodded slowly, the weight of Sarah's words sinking in. I see that now. I really do. I thought I knew what was best, but I didn't. I should have listened. I shouldn't have assumed I could fix anything. I I was just trying to help, Sarah. I'm sorry. The apology, though heartfelt, didn't ease the sharpness of the situation. Sarah took a moment to collect herself, then spoke again, her voice softer now, though still carrying the weight of her frustration. Karen, you have to understand something. I know you were trying to be helpful, but there are boundaries. Medical equipment isn't something you can just walk in and adjust without knowing what you're doing. It's not just about the machine being too loud or too much. It's about my health, my life. You can't just walk in here without asking, without understanding the situation, and start tampering with things that keep me alive. Karen's hands fidgeted in her lap, her shoulders slumped in shame. I never meant to put you in danger. I thought that maybe I could make it better, you know? I get that, Sarah said, her voice gentler now. I really do. I think you honestly thought you were helping. But that's the thing, Karen. Good intentions don't always mean it's the right thing to do. You can't help me by taking over, by assuming you know what's best for me, without ever asking or understanding my needs. You have to respect my space. You have to respect the boundaries that I set. Karen was quiet for a long moment, her eyes focused on the floor. Sarah could see her processing, thinking through her actions. And for the first time, Karen seemed to grasp the magnitude of her mistake. I hear you, Karen said softly, her voice shaking. I really do. I was out of line. I didn't think it through, and I'm sorry. I should have asked first. I should have respected your space and your needs. I promise, I won't ever do anything like that again. I'll never overstep like that again, I swear. Sarah nodded, her chest feeling lighter now. She wasn't sure if Karen fully understood just how serious the situation had been, but for the first time in a long while, she felt a small sense of relief. The conversation had been hard, but it was necessary. And as much as Sarah wanted to move on, she knew this was only the beginning of rebuilding trust. Thank you for apologizing, Sarah said, her voice steady. And I want to be clear. If you ever think you can help again, please just ask. But don't take it upon yourself to make changes without understanding what's going on. That's all I'm asking, and that's how we move forward. Karen nodded again, her eyes sincere. I get it. I'll do better. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but it was filled with the weight of the conversation. Sarah had spoken her truth, and Karen had heard it, even if it had taken a hard moment to get there. They both knew there was a long road ahead, but this was a start, and that, for now, was enough. After the conversation with Karen, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to deal with than just the emotional fallout. Her mind kept drifting back to the moment she'd struggled for breath, to the real physical danger she'd faced when Karen cut the oxygen line. As much as she wanted to move on, there was still the issue of what had happened, the medical consequences of the disruption, the legal implications, and the larger issue of privacy and respect in her own home. She knew she needed answers, and she needed to take action. A few days later, Sarah found herself sitting in a small exam room at her healthcare provider's office. The walls, usually calming with their soft, neutral colors, felt confining now as she waited for the nurse to come in. The weight of everything was starting to feel overwhelming, but she couldn't ignore the fact that what Karen had done could have resulted in something far worse. Dr. Lawson, a calm, methodical woman in her mid-40s, entered the room, her clipboard in hand. "Sarah, it's good to see you," she said with a reassuring smile, though Sarah could tell from the doctor's expression that she was aware of the seriousness of the situation. "Thanks, Dr. Lawson," Sarah replied, her voice still tinged with anxiety. "I wanted to come in for an assessment. After what happened with my oxygen, I'm just not sure if there's any lasting impact. I've been feeling off, and I wanted to be sure I'm okay." Dr. Lawson nodded, her expression shifting to one of concern. "I completely understand. It's important to be cautious when there's a disruption in oxygen supply, especially with a condition like yours. We'll take a look at everything and make sure there's no lasting damage." She motioned to a seat where Sarah could sit comfortably, and Sarah did so, feeling her nerves rise again. "After a thorough examination, Doctor." Lawson checked Sarah's vitals, taking note of her breathing patterns, blood pressure, and heart rate. She asked detailed questions about how Sarah had felt in the hours following the oxygen disruption, and Sarah shared her experience: the difficulty breathing, the dizziness, the tightness in her chest. "The immediate effects of oxygen deprivation can be serious," Dr. Lawson explained as she made some notes in Sarah's file. "In your case, it sounds like the lack of oxygen caused a mild hypoxic episode, which can lead to fatigue, confusion, and in some cases, long-term issues with organ function if it's prolonged. Fortunately, you received medical attention quickly, but the risks involved with an unregulated change in oxygen flow can't be overstated." Sarah felt a knot tighten in her stomach. "So, is there any permanent damage? Am I at risk of anything long-term?" Dr. Lawson paused, her eyes meeting Sarah's with a reassuring calm. "It's hard to say without further testing, but as of now, I don't see any immediate signs of lasting damage. However, if this sort of disruption happens again, you're at risk for more severe complications, particularly to your cardiovascular and respiratory systems. I would strongly recommend ensuring that the oxygen equipment is never tampered with again without professional oversight." The weight of her words settled heavily on Sarah's chest. It had been bad, but it could have been so much worse. The idea that something as simple as a disrupted oxygen line could lead to permanent damage was terrifying, but at least for now it seemed like she had dodged a bullet. "Thank you, Doctor Lawson," Sarah said quietly, feeling a mix of relief and lingering fear. "I'll make sure this never happens again." Later that week, Sarah made another appointment, this time not with a doctor, but with a lawyer. She knew that confronting Karen had been necessary on a personal level, but legally, things were more complicated. Karen had entered her home without permission, tampered with medical equipment, and caused her physical harm, even if it had been unintentional. Sarah had to know what her options were if she wanted to ensure something like this never happened again. The law office was quiet, and the smell of coffee lingered in the air as Sarah took a seat in front of a large wooden desk. The lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Rachel Matthews, sat across from her, flipping through Sarah's case notes. "I've gone over the details of your situation, Sarah," Rachel said, her tone professional but empathetic. "I'm sorry you had to go through this. From a legal standpoint, we're looking at a couple of potential issues: unauthorized entry, possible negligence, and medical malpractice, depending on the outcome of the medical assessment. There's also the issue of privacy invasion." Rachel leaned forward, resting her arms on the table. "You have the right to pursue legal action for any of these, though it would depend on whether or not you want to escalate the situation. If you do, we could look at filing a formal complaint for medical malpractice, or even taking her to court for trespassing and interference with medical equipment." Sarah's mind raced. She hadn't wanted it to get this far, but now, hearing Rachel lay out the options, she realized just how serious Karen's actions had been. "I'm not sure I want to go that route," she admitted, "but I need to know what I'm dealing with. I need to know that if something like this happens again, I have some protection." Rachel nodded, taking a moment to gather her thoughts. "We can definitely file for a restraining order or a formal notice to stay off your property, which would send a clear message about respecting your personal space and your medical needs. But it's also worth considering whether mediation or a direct settlement would be a better option if you want to avoid public exposure. After a few more minutes of discussion, Sarah left the office feeling both more informed and more uncertain. She had legal options, but the path ahead wasn't clear. Still, knowing that she had resources at her disposal made her feel a little more secure. It wasn't just about the incident. It was about making sure her health and her boundaries were respected moving forward. In the following weeks, the incident sparked a ripple of conversation within Sarah's neighborhood. Word spread, and neighbors who had once simply nodded to her in passing now approached her with cautious curiosity. At first, Sarah felt uncomfortable with the attention, but slowly the conversations began to shift in a positive direction. People started to ask questions about medical needs and respecting personal space. Several neighbors mentioned how they hadn't fully understood the impact of medical equipment, like Sarah's oxygen concentrator, until now. One evening, a small community meeting was organized by the local HOA, intended to address issues of privacy, safety, and medical awareness. Sarah decided to attend, hoping to use the opportunity to educate others. As she spoke about what had happened, explaining the importance of respecting each other's medical privacy and the dangers of unqualified interference, she saw the shift in her neighbors' attitudes. It wasn't just about her. It was about creating a more understanding and supportive environment for everyone. As the meeting ended, Sarah felt a strange sense of relief. She wasn't just moving forward with her own healing. She was helping to shape a more thoughtful, empathetic community. The experience had been traumatic, but it was also opening doors for deeper understanding, and for that she was grateful. The weeks that followed the incident were heavy with uncertainty, but Sarah was gradually finding a way forward. As much as she tried to push it out of her mind, Karen's actions had left a mark, and Sarah knew that rebuilding trust was going to take time, if it could even be rebuilt at all. Yet she had learned to cope with the emotional fallout, and the support from her medical team and lawyer had given her some sense of security. Still, there was one thing that needed to happen if any sense of peace was to return: Karen's apology. It wasn't long before Sarah received a message from Karen, asking if they could meet again. The words were simple, but Sarah could sense the hesitation in them. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she agreed. Part of her wanted to close the door completely on Karen, but another part of her knew that for her own peace of mind, this conversation was necessary. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, Sarah opened the door to find Karen standing on the porch, holding a small bouquet of flowers. She looked different, her posture less confident, more somber, and there was a deep sincerity in her eyes that Sarah hadn't seen before. Karen extended the flowers hesitantly, as though unsure if she had the right to offer them at all. "Hi, Sarah," Karen said softly, her voice tinged with apprehension. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened, and I realize I was wrong. I really hurt you, and I'm so sorry for that." Sarah took the flowers, feeling the weight of Karen's apology. There was no denying the vulnerability in her eyes, and for the first time since the incident, Sarah felt like Karen was truly seeing the gravity of her actions. "I've been replaying that day in my head over and over again," Karen continued, her voice cracking slightly, "and I can't believe I was so thoughtless. I really believed I was helping, but I didn't understand how much danger I was putting you in. I never should have gone into your home without your permission, and I never should have messed with something that's so important to your health. I've been so ashamed of what I did, and I can only imagine how scared you must have been." Sarah stood there for a moment, unsure of how to respond. There was a part of her that wanted to hold on to the anger, to stay angry for what Karen had done. But she knew that holding on to that anger wouldn't help her heal, and it certainly wouldn't help rebuild anything. "Karen," Sarah said slowly, her voice steady, "what you did scared me. It hurt me. But what I need you to understand is that it's not just about the oxygen machine or the disruption. It's about my health, my life. You can't just walk into someone's home and make decisions for them, especially when it comes to something as serious as medical care." Karen nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "I know, and I'll never do anything like that again. I swear I've learned my lesson. I didn't realize before how dangerous my actions were. I'm truly sorry, Sarah." There was a long silence between them, the weight of the words hanging in the air. It wasn't easy for Sarah to let go of everything, to move past the fear and the anger, but she knew that healing wouldn't happen if she held on to it all. She took a deep breath and spoke again. her voice softer now. I appreciate your apology, Karen. I really do. But there need to be boundaries. Clear ones. I can't go through something like this again. I need to know that my space, my health, will be respected. That includes my privacy, my medical needs, and my right to make decisions about my own care. Karen, her face still lined with guilt, nodded. I understand. I'll respect your boundaries from now on. I'll never try to help without asking again. I promise you that. The conversation was heavy, but for the first time in weeks, Sarah felt a glimmer of hope. Karen's apology, while not erasing the past, was a step toward healing, and it was a step toward establishing something more solid: mutual respect and understanding. The conversation had been difficult, but necessary. In the days that followed, Sarah noticed a shift not just in her relationship with Karen, but in her entire neighborhood. Word had spread about what had happened, and while the initial response had been one of shock and confusion, there was now an overwhelming sense of support. Neighbors who had once kept their distance now approached her with kindness, checking in to see how she was doing, offering help when needed, and, most importantly, offering to be there in any way they could. One afternoon, Sarah was in her front yard when Mrs. Green from 2 houses down approached with a homemade casserole in hand. I know things have been tough, Mrs. Green said with a warm smile, and I just wanted to check in on you. If you ever need anything, anything at all, please don't hesitate to ask. We're here for you, Sarah. It wasn't just Mrs. Green. There were several others. Neighbors who had stopped by, sent cards, or offered small acts of kindness. It felt strange at first, this sudden outpouring of support, but Sarah couldn't deny that it made her feel less alone. She had always felt somewhat isolated due to her medical condition, but now there was a sense of community she hadn't expected. Even the younger families in the neighborhood had begun asking more about how they could help. Some volunteered to assist with small tasks or simply to check in. The community, though initially unaware of Sarah's challenges, had rallied around her in a way she hadn't anticipated. The conversations about respecting each other's privacy and understanding medical needs became more frequent in the neighborhood, making Sarah realize that something positive was emerging from the chaos. At the next community meeting, Sarah stood in front of her neighbors, her voice steady as she shared her experience and the lessons she'd learned. She spoke about the importance of empathy, of being aware of one another's struggles, and of respecting boundaries. As she finished, several people clapped softly, a gesture that made her feel less like an outsider and more like a part of something larger. It wasn't a perfect resolution. There would still be moments of tension, and there was still work to be done in rebuilding her relationship with Karen. But for the first time in a long while, Sarah felt like she was moving forward. Not just alone, but surrounded by a community that cared, that understood the importance of respect, and that was ready to stand with her. As Sarah sat on her porch one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, she allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. The ordeal with Karen had shaken her to her core, but now, months later, Sarah could see things from a different perspective. It had been a difficult and terrifying experience, but in some ways it had changed her, not just in terms of how she viewed others, but how she saw herself. She had always prided herself on being independent, capable of managing her medical condition with grace and strength. But this incident had forced her to confront something she hadn't fully recognized before: her own vulnerability. The truth was, Sarah had often kept people at arm's length, not wanting to burden anyone with her needs, afraid of appearing weak or dependent. But after what had happened with Karen, Sarah had learned the importance of asking for help when she needed it, of trusting others to respect her boundaries, and, most importantly, of standing up for herself when those boundaries were crossed. She had learned to assert herself, not just for her health, but for her peace of mind. Before this, Sarah had been passive in many ways, allowing others to make decisions for her, especially when it came to her medical care. But now she felt empowered to take control, to educate those around her about the seriousness of her condition and the importance of respecting her space. The experience had also shown her something else: the power of setting boundaries. She'd always known intellectually that boundaries were important, but this was the first time she had truly understood their value. She'd seen firsthand how a lack of boundaries, whether in personal relationships or medical matters, could lead to harm. But now she was learning how to communicate her needs clearly, how to protect her space, and how to advocate for herself without fear. As Sarah reflected on everything, she found herself wondering how Karen was handling the aftermath. The woman who had once barged into her home without asking, making decisions about Sarah's health as if she had the right to do so, seemed a world away from the Karen she had come to know in the past few months. The apology had been an important step, but Sarah wondered if Karen had truly changed, if she had learned from the experience, or if it had just been a momentary realization. It didn't take long for Sarah to find her answer. Over time, Karen had become a more thoughtful, more considerate person. She would occasionally stop by to check on Sarah, but not in a way that felt intrusive or overwhelming. It was as though Karen had shifted, slowly but surely, toward becoming someone who truly understood the importance of consent, space, and respect. She began volunteering at local charity events and even took a course on caregiving to better understand the needs of those with chronic illnesses. Karen had gone from being someone who assumed she knew what was best for others to someone who sought to learn, listen, and offer support only when it was wanted. One afternoon, Karen knocked on Sarah's door, holding a stack of pamphlets in her hand. "Hey, Sarah, I was just going through some resources on healthcare for people with chronic conditions," she said, her tone warm and earnest. "I thought you might find these useful. And I just wanted to let you know, I've been reading more about oxygen therapy and how it works. I never really understood how serious it could be until everything happened, but I'm trying to learn more so I can be more mindful in the future." Sarah looked at her for a long moment before accepting the pamphlets. She could see the sincerity in Karen's eyes, and though it was still strange to have Karen around again after everything that had happened, she found herself feeling thankful. "I appreciate that," Sarah said quietly, smiling slightly. "It means a lot that you're taking the time to understand, and I really appreciate the respect you're showing. It's not always easy to admit when we've been wrong, but I think it's important to try to grow from our mistakes." Karen nodded, her gaze soft. "I'm just glad we're moving forward, and I promise I'll never do anything like that again. I've learned a lot from this." As Sarah closed the door behind Karen, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. It wasn't about forgiveness for the sake of it, but about moving forward with new understanding and mutual respect. She didn't expect perfection from Karen, but she was beginning to see the real, tangible effort Karen was putting into changing her approach to others. The changes weren't limited to just Sarah and Karen. Slowly, the neighborhood itself began to transform. What had started as an isolated incident had rippled out, sparking conversations and raising awareness. People began to look out for each other in new ways, offering help where it was needed, but also respecting each other's space. Neighbors started organizing informal check-ins, creating a support network for those with health issues, making sure that no one felt isolated or unseen. There were small acts of kindness that spread like wildfire, helping with groceries, offering rides to appointments, and simply taking the time to ask how someone was doing. The neighborhood that once felt like a collection of strangers had slowly become a community, bound together not just by proximity, but by a shared commitment to understanding and empathy. Sarah noticed the change most when she walked down the street. People who had once barely acknowledged her now waved, stopped to chat, and genuinely asked how she was. There was a sense of care in the air, a quiet reminder that, even in the most difficult of situations, human connection could prevail. It wasn't just about surviving, it was about thriving together, learning from each other and supporting one another. As Sarah sat on her porch in the evenings, watching the neighborhood around her, she couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude. It hadn't been easy, but through it all, she had found strengths she didn't know she had. And more than that, she had seen the power of a community that, when faced with adversity, could come together in ways that made them all stronger. It wasn't a perfect world, but it was one where, slowly but surely, understanding and respect were becoming the foundation of something beautiful.